It's amazing, isn't it, how these big movements in history, like, they can be so strong one minute, and then, well, things change. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. They kind of ebb and flow, like their impact shifts over time.
Right, and that's exactly what we're going to dig into today. This is something you've been thinking about too, judging by the stuff you sent us. The whole past, present, and future of Islamic civilization. So we're going to use Allawi's book, The Crisis of Islamic Civilization, to kind of guide our deep dive today.
Sounds good. Yeah, and in this deep dive, what we really want to do is like pull out the most important ideas from Allawi about where Islamic civilization has been, what big problems it's facing, and maybe where it could be headed, what the future holds. And we'll be working directly from those excerpts you gave us, trying to make this discussion as clear and insightful as possible.
Yeah, and you've given us a lot to work with, from those like super personal stories about how society has changed to some pretty big analyses of the political, social, intellectual, and spiritual forces that have shaped the Muslim world. I mean, we're talking centuries here. Wow. Okay, so to get us started, Alawi opens with this like really vivid image, you know?
He does. He starts by talking about his grandfather, like picturing him in these traditional clothes, the robes and turban, like something from a different time.
Right.
And it's such a stark contrast to how Alawi himself grew up, It really shows you how much things had changed.
Definitely setting the stage. And then he goes on to talk about how he saw this decline in like public religious rituals and stuff that used to be a huge part of life, things like the Sufi orders. Historically, they had tons of followers, but Alawi felt like they were fading away, like even becoming something people made fun of, especially among those like those westernized elites. He even mentions seeing what he thought was maybe one of the last wandering dervishes.
And it wasn't just the Sufis either. Alawi noticed that while the Shia rituals during Muharram, commemorating Imam Hussein were still going on, sometimes even really intensely, the upper classes kind of saw them as a bit, well, unsophisticated, I guess. They preferred like more literary or intellectual gatherings to mark the occasion.
And all of this was happening as like the world was changing so much, right? Alawi describes Baghdad and really other major Muslim cities too, like Casablanca, Cairo, Damascus, Istanbul, Tehran, Karachi, Jakarta. They were all kind of embracing these modern, more secular forms of entertainment. Cinemas, cabarets, people were more relaxed about alcohol, having mixed gatherings. It's like secularism was really taking hold, especially among those who were, becoming more modern. And it was kind of pushing those traditional Islamic practices aside in their lives.
What I find really interesting is that Alawi later realized that what he saw as the core ethical part of Islam, like the moral substance of it, had weakened. And that really hit him because it felt so different from the rich ethical tradition he understood to be like essential to Islam. He points out this really important thing. When we talk about the problems Islam faces, we tend to focus on the politics, the social structures, or how Islamic law is interpreted, but we often forget about how important it is for individual Muslims to develop morally and ethically.
And that leads him to ask some really big questions. He wonders if we can even talk about a single Islamic civilization today. Maybe it's split into separate cultural groups. He thinks about whether a unique Islamic civilization can even come back again, or if that's not possible anymore. And this is maybe the deepest question. He wonders if modern society, with all its, complications and focus on secularism, can actually work with a worldview that's based on divine inspiration.
It's a really good question, and it's fascinating when you consider the huge amount of diversity in the Muslim world in terms of ethnicity, language, and geography. But despite all that, Alawi stresses that historically there has been this unity rooted in the idea of submitting to the divine, which, as you mentioned before, is basically what Islam means.
Right.
He argues that this core idea is what's prevented Islam from completely dissolving in the face of modernity. So yeah, you see all these different ways Islam is expressed, but this commitment to something beyond ourselves, that's been the constant thread. And the book, he makes clear it's not so much about the political side of Islam or even just the religious doctrines, but more about, can Muslims hold on to that connection to the transcendent? And how does that fundamental commitment affect their actions, both individually and as a society?
Okay, so moving on from that initial setup, Alavi zooms out a bit and looks at what shapes civilizations in general. He introduces this idea that every civilization kind of balances how much it emphasizes the individual versus the group, and how much it focuses on worldly concerns versus spiritual, otherworldly stuff. And he argues that how these things shift and interact is what makes each civilization unique and determines its path.
And to make this clear, he gives some really good examples from history. He talks about these Oriental despotisms where the whole civilization revolved around glorifying, almost worshiping the ruler.
Oh, wow.
Then he contrasts that with the Roman Republic where, the values and identity were all about group institutions like the Senate. And we see how Rome itself changed as those republican ideals gave way to the emperors.
Right, right.
He brings up the totalitarian communist societies of the 20th century, where the individual was supposed to be totally absorbed into the collective. Although he's quick to point out, even in those systems, you often had this strong cult of personality around the leader. Finally, he positions the modern West, especially the Anglo-American world, as having shifted deliberately toward prioritizing the individual and the secular. There's this big focus on individual rights and using democratic processes as the main way for both personal and social progress.
Okay, that makes sense.
So tying this back to Allawi's main argument, he's saying that these turning points in history, they often happen when this balance between the individual and the group, or between worldly and otherworldly focus, gets disrupted. And these shifts can be caused by big events like wars or economic collapses, or they can happen more gradually internally. Like he uses the rise of Christianity within the Roman Empire as an example of that kind of transformative internal shift.
And if we look at today's world, Ally is pointing out the dominance of a certain way of thinking, a paradigm that really emphasizes the individual, secularism, liberal democracy as the political system, and a market economy driven by globalization and technology. He specifically mentions thinkers like Friedman and Hayek and how these values are often presented as universally applicable, like they're being pushed on a global scale.
Right, which brings us to a crucial point. How does the Islamic worldview fit into all of this? Allawi explains that, at its heart, Islam believes in a moral order that comes from God. So it rejects the idea that humans have absolute freedom to decide what's right and wrong. And this is a fascinating point. He says that recognizing a higher authority, a divine authority, doesn't actually diminish human dignity. It elevates it because humans are seen as aligning their will with a greater, purposeful order.
I like that.
Yeah. And he outlines the two main ways Islam tries to understand and connect with this divine plan. Through human reason and through divine revelation, which is expressed in the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad's teachings. Reason is super important for interpreting and applying God's will in different situations, but Allawi emphasizes that there are limits to what human reason alone can figure out about ultimate truth and morality. He really stresses the fact that core ethical principles don't change. Like certain things, murder, theft, those are always wrong, no matter the social context or what people's opinions are. There's no room for moral relativism when it comes to these foundational principles of Islam.
He also talks about the role of intermediaries in connecting with the sacred. He recognizes that, religious traditions try to make that path to the divine understandable, but there's always the potential for those intermediaries, whether they're people or institutions, to distort things or even block the direct relationship between the individual and the divine.
Definitely a risk.
Yeah. One of the insightful things Allawi argues is that these core Islamic principles were pretty much upheld until around the 18th and 19th centuries. He says this erosion of consensus happened because of a few things, like the decline of big Muslim empires and a kind of intellectual paralysis. They couldn't grasp the true nature of the challenges they were facing beyond just losing political power or seeing a weakening of religious doctrine. He describes this period as one where the lines between those who wanted to stick strictly to tradition and those who looked to modern Western ideas got harder and harder.
Yeah, you can see that tension building. And he makes this important distinction between how Muslim populations lived under non-Muslim rule earlier in history, which often led to, expulsions and social upheaval, and the kind of imperial intrusions that happened in the 19th and 20th centuries. These later intrusions, they were all about economic and political control, and they ended up attacking the very foundation of the Islamic worldview in a way that earlier interactions hadn't. He even quotes this lament from 1879 about how learning was advancing rapidly in the West while the East seemed to be declining.
Wow. To illustrate how big this shift was, Allawi talks about Abd el-Qadir, the Algerian leader who fought against French colonization. He points out that Abd el-Qadir realized his struggle was ultimately unsustainable. not because of a lack of faith or bravery, but because the French were just way ahead in terms of technology and organization. Alawi says that this realization makes Abd al-Qadir such a key figure. He bridges that world of pre-modern Islamic resistance with the growing awareness of the massive challenges posed by the modern world that was emerging.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember that along with being this amazing leader and strategist, Abdel Qadir was also deeply spiritual, rooted in Sufi traditions. Alawi points out that this spiritual side has often been overlooked, even dismissed, especially by those modernist thinkers who saw traditional Islamic spirituality as like part of the problem, a reason for the perceived decline of Muslim societies. He reminds us about Abdel Qadir's intense spiritual practices and this really incredible act of protecting thousands of Christians in Damascus during the violence in 1860. It shows a profound ethical and spiritual commitment that went far beyond narrow political concerns.
Okay, so now we get to the different ways the Muslim world reacted to the rising influence and power of modernity. Alawi dives into the Salafiyya movement. It started as an intellectual response to European dominance. This movement wanted to go back to what they saw as a purer, more fundamentalist form of Islam, based on how the first generations of Muslims practiced it, before what they saw as centuries of straying from the true path. And it's an important insight, as Alawi points out, that despite looking back to the past, Salafism is really a modern thing. It was born out of the specific challenges of the modern era, and it later really merged with the Wahhabi movement.
He then contrasts that with the rise of secular nationalism among some intellectuals. These intellectuals, they'd become disillusioned with the idea of reforming Islamic political institutions. They were influenced by thinkers like Renan and by the work of Orientalists who often focused on separate national identities. So these intellectuals started to see the nation-state and the ideology of nationalism as potential replacements for the traditional, religiously based unity of Islamic civilization.
And Allawi highlights how different regions dealt with these challenges. Turkey, with its new leadership in the early 20th century, pretty much broke away from its Ottoman and Islamic past and embraced a more secular national identity. But Egypt took a more complicated path. They were still engaged with their Islamic heritage while also adopting some modern ideas. Thinkers like Taha Hussein, who emphasized Egypt's Mediterranean identity, and that influential Salafist movement around Rashid Rida's Al-Manar journal, they show this more nuanced and often internally conflicted engagement.
He also talked about the huge influence of Muhammad Iqbal's philosophy. Iqbal focused on this idea, the dynamic individual striving for spiritual realization, actively shaping their destiny according to divine principles. He was a big critic of nationalism. He saw it as divisive. And he became a major intellectual inspiration for the movement to create a separate Muslim state on the Indian subcontinent. Alawi quotes this powerful statement from his 1930 address: "Islam is itself destiny and will not suffer a destiny."
Wow, that's a good one.
Yeah, and then there's Sayyid Nursi. His Risale Nur movement was all about strengthening individual Muslims' faith as a way to resist secularism. Nursi emphasized studying Islamic teachings and forming these study circles. He prioritized reinforcing belief over direct political action as the main way to renew society.
So, looking back at this period, what do you think is most important? It seems like from World War I to the mid-1970s, there was this period of intense questioning and reevaluation of Islam's role in the modern world. And that led to what Allawi calls the revolt of Islam in the 1970s, this big, civilization-wide pushback against decline, external control, and bad governance.
Yeah, you're right. It was a time of huge upheaval.
After this resurgence, Allawi brings in thinkers who focused on the intellectual challenge of how to bring about civilizational renewal in this modern context. He highlights Malik Banabi, whose work was all about the colonizability of the Muslim mind. Banabi argued that real change wouldn't come mainly from political action or taking over state power. It would come from transforming the individual's consciousness and how they act.
And Banabi had this interesting framework with 3 elements that are necessary for civilizational action: educated and morally upright individuals, available resources, and using time effectively. He said that religious drive is a crucial catalyst. It energizes these elements. His main point was that the decline in religious motivation and the weakening of core moral values had led to a state of dependence and colonizability in many Muslim societies.
Allawi also discusses Ayatollah Baqi al-Sadr, who offered a really rigorous critique of both communism and capitalism from an Islamic perspective. His important works, like Ittisaduna and Falsafatuna, were specifically aimed at engaging young, educated people and countering the appeal of raw Islamic ideologies. Although, as Allawi points out, al-Sadr's access to contemporary Western thought was kind of limited because of the political situation at the time.
Yeah, definitely a factor.
And then we see this undeniable resurgence of Islam starting in the 1970s. But as Allawi smartly points out, it's not a unified movement. It's been marked by some serious internal divisions, especially between Shia and Sunni Muslims, and the rise of sectarianism. Plus, there's this huge challenge of how to authentically reshape Islamic civilization in a world shaped by modern realities. He even points to how some attempts at Islamization seem kind of superficial, like having prayer rooms in financial institutions that still work on interest, or the whole designer hijab trend. It's like engaging on a surface level.
Yeah, like they're missing the deeper point.
Right. This fragmentation and potential for shallowness lead Allawi into a discussion about the struggle for knowledge and identity. He says Muslims have, to a large extent, become alienated from their own rich intellectual traditions because they've widely adopted Western educational systems that are often disconnected from religious and ethical frameworks. He makes this fascinating comparison between how Western colleges started and the traditional mosque-madrasa complexes, highlighting how their fundamental principles differ.
It's a really interesting point, and he notes how traditional Islamic centers of learning, like Al-Azhar, Zaytuna, and the major Shia seminaries, have declined in importance and influence, while secular modern universities are becoming more dominant. This brings us to Syed Naqib al-Attas, who had this really profound and influential critique of secularism itself. He argued that secularism is a specifically Western response to its own historical context, and Islamic societies shouldn't see it as a necessary or even desirable stage to go through.
Al-Attas really pushed for the idea of the Islamic university. Its goal would be to produce what he called the complete man, someone deeply rooted in Islamic knowledge and able to navigate the modern world with a clear ethical compass. He founded ISTAC in Malaysia to further this vision. But Allawi notes that Al-Attas's ideas, while very influential in academic circles, didn't really catch on with the broader public as much as that more politically focused Islamization of knowledge movement led by people like Ismail Raji al-Faruqi and the Eddie.
Yeah, the political approach often seems to get more traction.
Right. Allawi also brings in the work of Muhammad Abed al-Jabiri, who did this whole analysis of what he called the structure of the Arab mind. Al-Jabiri criticized how foundational texts and esoteric knowledge dominated Islamic intellectual history, saying it came at the expense of developing empirical reason and critical inquiry, which held back the emergence of a truly modern Islamic rationality.
Interesting.
And Allawi makes it a point to touch on the critiques of that standard Western narrative that the Reformation and the Enlightenment are the only universally good paths to modernity. He asks this fundamental question: do Islamic societies have to follow the same historical path, or are there other ways to progress and develop that fit better with Islamic principles and values?
Yeah, assuming that one size fits all is a dangerous game.
Definitely. And then we get to this more worrying aspect of today's situation, the turn toward violence and a kind of breaking down of established Islamic orthodoxy. Allawi points out a noticeable shift in where people see contemporary Islamic militancy coming from. It's moved somewhat away from that revolutionary Shia Islam we saw in the Iranian Revolution and more toward interpretations based on Wahhabism and the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah, the medieval scholar.
Right. He explains Ibn Taymiyyah's rejection of blindly following past authorities, what's called taqlid, and his emphasis on independent reasoning, or ijtihad, but within a framework defined by a very literal interpretation of Sharia law. Allawi highlights how this approach has become a major influence on modern Wahhabi and Salafi thought.
But Allawi also points out the potential downsides and, unintended consequences of this way of thinking. He suggests it can make legal and theological interpretations super rigid. This can sometimes lead to, extreme or even bizarre rulings, and it can weaken that historical flexibility and adaptability that used to be characteristic of Islamic legal tradition. He talks about this ongoing tension within Islam between the need to preserve unchanging principles and the necessity of adapting and changing in response to new circumstances.
It's a tension that runs through a lot of religious traditions, I think.
Yeah, for sure. To dig deeper into this tension, Allawi introduces Abdolkarim Soroush's idea of the evolution of religious knowledge. Soroush challenges the idea that Sharia law is absolutely unchanging, proposing that our understanding of religious texts and principles can and does evolve over time as we learn new things and social contexts change. He suggests that modern ethical values and even secular legal systems could be compatible with a deeply religious society that's guided by a morality ultimately rooted in faith. But Allawi does point out the criticism this view has received, especially about the idea that Islamic knowledge is grounded in the Quran and the Prophet's tradition, which many believe are timeless and unchanging.
It's a complex debate.
Definitely. So, turn into Islam's position in the global order, Allawi discusses the big changes that happened after 9/11 and the War on Terror. He highlights the increased pressure on Muslim-majority countries to fall in line with a Western-dominated global system.
Yeah, that pressure is undeniable.
He also points out that Samuel Huntington's clash of civilizations idea is still around in some circles, and that in many parts of the West, Islam is still seen as fundamentally the other. He also sees what he calls a selective application of human rights principles, where it's more acceptable to criticize Islam than other sensitivities within Western societies.
Interesting observation.
Right. Allawi also doesn't shy away from the issue of economic underdevelopment in many parts of the Muslim world. While he cautions against simple explanations that blame everything on Islam itself, he acknowledges the very real economic gap compared to other regions. He also offers a pretty critical assessment of Islamic economics and finance, saying that what a lot of people call Islamic banking has mostly become just a superficial adaptation of conventional finance rather than a truly different and ethically grounded alternative.
He's not pulling any punches there.
No, he's not. And this feeling of decline isn't just about economics. Allawi talks about what he sees as a decline in creativity and innovation within Muslim societies, linking it to this broader abandonment of the traditional Islamic worldview. He compares the historical period when Islamic science, medicine, and urban planning were all deeply integrated with a specific spiritual and intellectual framework rooted in this idea of submission to the infinite with how things are today.
Right, a real shift in perspective.
Exactly. He gives this really vivid description of the traditional Islamic city where religious, social, and economic functions were all connected, and even craft guilds were often tied to Sufi orders. It fostered a sense of community and ethical practice. Then he contrasts this with the modern Islamic city, which he often describes as overcrowded, not very aesthetically pleasing, heavily influenced by Western architecture, and dealing with problems like corruption and uncontrolled development.
He paints quite a picture.
He does, and he's especially critical of those hypermodern, often super lavish cities in the Gulf region. He doesn't see them as real examples of Islamic urbanism. Instead, he sees them as these aspirational projects that go against the core ideas of the traditional Islamic city. They're driven by rampant consumerism and an obsession with Western brands and status symbols.
So more form over substance, in a way.
Exactly. And finally, Allawi describes our current moment as a possibly decisive last crisis. He says it's brought about by this combination of Western expansion, the pervasive influence of modernity, and how fast globalization is happening. He argues that these things together have created a deep sense of uncertainty and are challenging traditional boundaries and identities in totally new ways. He points out that many people want economic improvement, and there's this tendency to judge how successful a nation is based only on its technology, its economy, and how well it follows democratic norms.
Yeah, a very specific and limited set of criteria.
Exactly. And he points out that some modern expressions of Islamic identity in public life are pretty superficial, like there might be outward displays of religiosity, but they don't address those deeper contradictions or ethical challenges. He emphasizes how important it is to have an ethical framework grounded in a spiritual understanding of Islam, one characterized by courtesy and modesty toward God and other people. And he's worried about how this ethical consciousness is being eroded because traditional social structures and norms are weakening. He ends by talking about the Tablighi Jamaat as an example of a modern movement trying to revive a way of life based on the practices of the earliest Muslims, noting its widespread influence but also acknowledging the controversies and criticisms it's faced.
It's interesting how he brings in those specific examples to illustrate his points.
Yeah, it makes it so much more real. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Allawi's work, it's clear that we've just scratched the surface of what is a really complex and multifaceted crisis within Islamic civilization. This crisis spans history, intellectual debates, spiritual perspectives, and socio-political realities. We've encountered a lot of different views on the nature of this crisis and what the potential solutions might be. Some people want to return to the core principles, while others are trying to reinterpret Islamic teachings and find ways to engage with modern systems and ideas.
It's a lot to grapple with, for sure. And it really leaves us with a big question for you, our listener, to think about. Considering all the challenges and the various responses we've discussed, what do you think is the most crucial factor that will shape the future of Muslim societies and their relationship with the rest of the world? It's a big question, and definitely one worth pondering further. Maybe even revisit those sources you shared with us with these new ideas in mind.
I like that. It's a good challenge.
Yeah, and the issues we've explored today offer a really rich and stimulating area for more study. We definitely encourage you to dig deeper into the thinkers and topics we've touched on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. It's been a great discussion.